Hello everyone, I'm going to get started. My name is Nick Yi. I'm the co-founder of Quantic Foundry, and I'm going to be talking to you today about gamer motivations. Let's say I asked you all to come up with a list of the key gaming motivations that gamers vary on. I think in a room full of gamers and game developers, none of us would have any trouble coming up with our own lists. But some of us may come up, all lists will be a little different. Some of us may come up with a list of 4 high-level motivations. Others may have dozens of fine-grained motivations. Some of us may propose that socializing and competition are opposite ends of the same spectrum. In fact, some of us may not even agree what competition means in the first place. So what do we do? How do we decide? And how do we measure these motivations in the first place? As many of you know, there's a standardized process in psychology research to address this exact question. It revolves around factor analysis, which is a statistical technique that identifies how variables cluster together or don't cluster together. So imagine if we collected a lot of survey data, asking players on a 5-point Likert scale to rate the importance of a variety of gaming variables. What the factor analysis does is it tells us how those variables cluster together, what's the underlying structure of those variables. So in this case, we find that there are 2 underlying factors. The one on the left that focuses on leveling up and becoming as powerful as possible, we may label as achievement. And the one on the right that focuses on chatting and making friends, we may call socializing. Factor analysis is kind of like celebrity deathmatch in a way. We can throw in a lot of factors and models and let the factor analysis tell us what model actually emerges. And that's what we did. We went through the academic and industry literature on gaming motivations. So whether they called it gaming motivations or player taxonomies or models of fun, we extracted the motivations that had been proposed in the field. And we generated about 50 pilot items for a survey. So example items are, how much do you enjoy games with elaborate storylines? How important is it to you to play a game at the highest difficulty setting, and so forth. We used a bootstrap approach to collect the data and iterate on the model. We started with a panel of 600 gamers to create a good enough model. We then created an online app. Gamers could come, take a 5-minute survey, and get a personalized report of their gaming motivations relative to the gamers in our sample. And as their data came in, we kept constantly rerunning factor analysis. We replaced items that loaded poorly until a robust model emerged. So here's an example of the profile, a customized report that were presented online to gamers who came through and took the profile test. We also designed it so that it was easy to share on social media. We released the first version of this tool back in early June of last year, and in the first wave, we got about 30,000 gamers who took this profile tool, and we used that to revise a model and the underlying math significantly. We then did a second push in July, and in the second push, Ars Technica, among other websites, picked it up. What they did was actually have a lot of members on the staff take the profile, and in their write-up, they talked about the outliers in their group and so forth. On the day of the Ars Technica hit, at its peak, we had over 600 concurrent users on the site going through the profile. After every media hit, there would be a long tail of social media sharing. About 80% of our traffic actually came from Facebook and Twitter, social media combined. To date, we have over 220 gamers who've come through and taken the gamer motivation profile, counted as unique IP addresses. Most of the gamers come from North America and the Western EU, but we also have sizable subsamples from Southeast Asia and South America. Here's the model that emerged from the data that we got. We identified 12 unique motivations that clustered into 6 pairs. Every column contains motivations that are highly correlated, and motivations in different columns are less correlated. Most of these should feel fairly familiar and straightforward, so let me go through them briefly. Under action, is the appeal of chaos and mayhem in exciting, fast-paced gameplay contexts. Under social are both competition and the interest in collaboration and socializing. Mastery is about long-term planning and thinking. So whether that's practicing a game to take on the highest difficulty challenges, or the enjoyment of strategy, thinking and planning ahead, making complex decisions. Achievement are different ways of getting points in the context of the game, whether it's points for the sake of points as in achievements, stars, trophies, or points in the sense of power, leveling up your character as quickly as possible, getting powerful equipment and gear. Immersion are different ways of becoming embedded in the story of the world, whether that's the sheer sense of being immersed, being someone else, somewhere else, or engaging with an elaborate plot, with interesting characters, with deep backstories. And finally, creativity is the appeal of making the game your own in different ways, whether that's creating a unique avatar, customizing your spaceship, customizing your city, or discovery, playing the game in the broadest sense of the word. So for example, in World of Warcraft, these are the people who may swim out to the edge of the ocean just to see what happens when you're on the edge. This is the most fine-grained slide of the motivations I'll show you. And for the rest of the talk, I'm gonna build upwards and outwards. So let me build upwards first. I mentioned that the motivations in each column are highly correlated and less so across columns. But the degree of those correlations change. So what would be really neat is if we could visualize the relationships of these 12 variables in a visual map. And that's what we did. And when we did that, we found that at a high level, there are 3 clusters that emerge. We can plot out this map using a technique called multidimensional scaling. So the motivations that are more highly correlated show up closer on this map, and the motivations that are less correlated are further apart. And there are 3 clusters. So I'm going to show you the North America data first. There are 3 clusters that form. So on the top blue cluster are the mastery achievement components, strategy, challenge. On the left yellow cluster are the story, design, fantasy, creativity elements. And on the bottom right, the red cluster, are the action social components, so community, competition, excitement, and destruction. We thought what was interesting was that there are 2 motivations that are kind of on the edge of these clusters. They form almost bridges. So discovery is the bridge between the story cluster and the strategy cluster, and power is the bridge between the challenge strategy cluster and the action social cluster. We did this, the multidimensional scaling, for every geographic region we had sufficient data for, and the same map emerged. I'm going to go through these fairly briefly. So all the main components stay within their colored areas, and discovery and power are always the ones on the edges in the same positions: Western Europe, Eastern Europe, for Southeast Asia, for Australia and New Zealand, and finally for South America. This structure is consistent across all the geographic areas we had the data for. Let me build outwards now. So let me connect our motivation model with other existing trait inventories, such as personality traits. We found at a high level that the 3 clusters we identified map onto well-known personality traits in psychology research. I'm going to focus on the action social cluster, which we thought was the most interesting and unintuitive cluster. And I say unintuitive in the sense that in the research that we ran through, in the literature review, we found few, if any, existing research that paid special attention to the relationship between the action social motivations that we had identified between competition, community, excitement, and destruction. And it kind of boggled us for a moment, was why the action social cluster? The other 2 kind of made sense. But in hindsight, it's actually something that we could have predicted from personality psychology research. I'm going to do a quick flip to the Big Five, which I know a lot of you already know about. In personality psychology, the Big Five is the current standard for modeling and understanding and assessing human personality trait differences. It's been used in research over multiple decades. It's a very well-known model. In pop psychology, everyone thinks they know what extroversion and introversion mean. So in pop psychology, the focus is on whether you're very social or you're quiet and reserved. But what decades of psychology research have shown is that there's actually a really interesting and rich cluster of traits around extroversion. So people who are more outgoing, who are more extroverted, they also tend to be more cheerful, more optimistic, more likely to seek excitement and thrills, and more likely to be assertive in group situations. So in a way, action social, the reason why those motivations cluster together, it's a reflection of extroversion. It's really those same traits in extroversion that are being expressed in a gameplay context. The other two connections were a little more straightforward. So conscientiousness is how organized and self-disciplined you are. It matches the long-term thinking of the strategy, the achievement prong. Openness is how curious, how imaginative, how unorthodox you are. That maps to the emerging creativity prong. And when I say map, I don't only mean based on sheer intuition. I mean, we have the data for this. So alongside the gamer motivation profile, we also had an optional Big Five inventory that also produced a real-time customized report. And based on the data from gamers who took both profiling tools, we can actually look at this question. So for action social, extroversion correlated positively and significantly with 3 of the 4 motivations in that cluster. For immersion discovery, we had openness correlate significantly with all 4 of the motivations. With conscientiousness and strategy achievement, it was a little weaker. We only had it on strategy. So for example, this means that people who score high on extroversion also tend to be thrill seekers in games. They like competition, they like social interaction, and so forth. So in the media framing of games, there's always this assumption that games are fundamentally escapist, they enable people to pretend to be someone that they're not. But if you buy the data that we have, it's really the opposite, picture, right? Games are kind of an identity management tool. Gamers gravitate toward the gameplay that aligns with their core personality traits. So rather than enabling people to pretend to be someone who they're not, video games help us become more of who we really are. I'm going to slice through the data demographically. So at a high level, we found at first that gender differences align with gender stereotypes. In the data, every gamer who comes through gets 12 scores, percentile ranks on the motivations. We look at just their highest percentile rank and we say, okay, this is the bucket we're going to put you in. Here's what the data looks like, right? So the hundreds of thousands of data points and everyone is 1 dot in here. Let me chop this by gender. What we found was that for women, the blue bars, their primary motivations were much more likely to be fantasy, design, and completion. For men, the green bars, it was much more likely to be destruction, competition, strategy, and challenge. But then we dug deeper and we found a more interesting pattern. It turns out that a lot of these gender differences are dwarfed by age differences. So let me show you, I'm going to focus just on competition, which was the motivation that had the largest gender difference. On the x-axis is age from 15 to 55. Every dot is the average, the mean of all the data we had in each age point. And the colored dots are genders. So the green dots are the women, the blue dots are the men. So there are 2 interesting trends here. So the first one is that the gender difference starts out quite wide, but essentially disappears with age. By the time you're past age 45, there's essentially no gender difference in competition. But the second trend is more interesting. So if you look at the widest gap, among the youngest gamers here on the left side, and then you compare the youngest men with the oldest men, that gap is bigger between the youngest and oldest men than between the biggest gap between the men and the women. There's a way to quantify the effect size of age and gender. So age, in terms of competition, actually accounts for twice the variance that gender does. We can also calculate the overlap between groups. So between men and women, in terms of competition, there's actually an 87% overlap on their competition scores. In the gaming industry, we spend a lot of time talking about differences between men and women and what games for women might look like. But I think what the data is showing is that the elephant in the room is really age and age differences. And that instead of talking so much about what it means to design games for women and what it looks different from men, we really need to start talking more about what does it mean to design games for people as they get older. Speaking of age, we also have data on that. It turns out the action social cluster varies the most dramatically with age. It's the most age volatile cluster, and it's different for men and for women. So for the men, the entire action social cluster drops. Competition, excitement, challenge, community, it all drops, and they're all in the action social cluster. For the women, excitement and competition are still there, but the one addition is story. So younger women are much more interested in deep narratives than older women are. I spent a lot of time talking about the findings from the motivation data. I'm going to pivot in the last 5-7 minutes into unexpected ways we've been able to play with the data due to its sheer scale, and because of the addition of one serendipitous question we had in the survey. So in the gamer motivation profile, we asked gamers to list up to 3 of their favorite game titles. And we did this at first just as a way to potentially debug the survey. So if anything went weird with the factor analysis, we could go back and look at the games that people listed to try to debug the process. And this turned out to be a really fortuitous question for us. So in the survey, up to 3 in free form, we used Mechanical Turk to do the coding. We did a majority vote to clean up all the text into canonical titles. So one of the early things we realized we could do was for anyone who came through and took the gamer motivation profile, we could look in our data to find the 1,000 neighbors who are most similar to them in terms of their motivation profile. It's like your 1,000 virtual groupies. And surface the games that they put in their favorite list as a way to create a game recommender engine. If multiple people come through, say you and your buddy come through, and you both take the gamer motivation profile, we can do the Venn diagram of that, right? The games you like, the game the other person like, and the games you both like. It's like a 2-person game recommender engine. So we did this, and we realized we could flip this around, right? Instead of going from game motivation to game titles, we can actually start from game titles and then pivot the other way around. So for the almost 1,000 unique game titles in our data, we can look up each of them and generate the demographic and motivation profile of the core engaged audience of that game and the games that those gamers were most likely to list as their favorites. And then we realized we have this data for a lot of games, and so we can focus on, say, a game genre space and plot out the audience proximities of game titles, for that genre. So let's take the strategy game genre, and here I've laid it out just on the strategy axis on the bottom, from lower to higher, and the excitement axis, lower to higher on the vertical axis. And before anyone gets really mad at me, this is of course relative to the strategy genre, and that there's wide open spaces on the on the left and on the bottom. And we've done this for a lot of genres, and we oftentimes run into interesting patterns in each genre space. So here in the strategy genre, when we plot this out, Nick and I were like, isn't it interesting that the top right quadrant is entirely empty? And in hindsight, we're like, well, it kind of makes a lot of sense. If I have a game where you have to make a really complex decision, you have to process a lot of data like Europa Universalis, I have to give you the time to make that decision. even allow you to pause the game or do it on a turn-based basis so you can make that complex decision. Because if I force you to make that decision in real time, and you can play Europa Universalis in 4x real time, which is no fun. And that's the point, right? It's that there's a cognitive threshold. You only have limited cognitive resources. If I push you over that edge, the game stops being fun. It starts being frustrating. Conversely, you know, if a game that is real time, it's high speed, it's really multiplayer, there's a limit to how complex a decision I can force you to make. And so there's a trade-off between strategic complexity and your reaction time in terms of your cognitive resources. And so, you know, based on the data that we think that there's an estimated cognitive threshold that lies somewhere along this line. We think that games that fall far beyond this line stop being fun for the majority of gamers, but they may make really compelling esports if they're just beyond that line. For each of the dots in this chart, I think we all have the intuition they're not a homogeneous group, right? Some of these dots are probably a little more homogeneous, others may be a lot more heterogeneous, and we can also explore that. So we've been playing very recently with, let's say I drill down into a subspace in here, like the XCOM space or the Civ space. We can do cluster analysis to identify, using the data and the motivations that we have, the personas, the distinct personas that underlie a game title, a subgenre space, a franchise space, and so forth. So we've been playing with this, that we can generate these personas and get a sense, based on our data, on the rough distributions of those personas underlying each of these more or less homogeneous subgroups. Those are all the slides I have for you. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. I'm happy to take your questions. Yeah, I wasn't sure how to, I wasn't sure if I was waiting for someone to give them the mic or.
First of all, that was amazing.
Thank you.
Incredibly insightful. One of the things I was wondering about when I was looking at how you were quantifying your model is if you took into account things like non-game related factors of popularity. So when people select their favorite game, League of Legends has a far wider distribution than most other MOBAs, which are psychologically similar in a gameplay instance.
No, that's a really good question. So that was actually one of the first problems we had to solve when figuring out this popular games list surfacing. The problem is in almost every game that we looked at, the top 5 popular games that people list are World of Warcraft, League of Legends, Minecraft, Skyrim, I forget the 5th. And the way we fix that problem is we take the baseline frequency into account. So we look at the full sample that we have. We know that World of Warcraft across our sample has, let's say, a 20% mention rate. And so in the local samples, we adjust by that baseline frequency to come up with an adjusted score. So we divide the local frequency by the baseline frequency. So a score of 2 means that in this local group, they're more likely to mention, let's say, civilization at twice the base rate of the full population. So that's how we remove the confound of games that are just generically popular.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to second that. It was just wonderful data. Thanks for presenting. Did you do any normalization on acquisition channels? So if the survey was posted to Reddit, you'd probably get a way different response than Ars Technica versus what you got through Facebook. Did you account for that in any way?
No. So, you know, it wasn't something that we were able to account for. Our tracking only worked so far in terms of the acquisition channel. And in fact, I think even if we had it, I'm not exactly sure what we would have done to control for those confounds exactly. So I think our main strategy was to collect as much data as possible And then if needed, we could drill down. If needed, we could, we ask, whether they're self-reported casual core, hardcore, whether you regularly play on PC or a console or mobile. Those are things that we could filter out later on, but it wasn't something that we control for in terms of acquisition channel.
Thanks for the talk. So there's been issues in the past with surveys that go out like this that get to places like 4chan and Reddit where Gamergate communities tend to inhabit that flood responses. Did you guys have criteria for weeding out potentially fake or filler or whatever?
You know what was funny? The first question in the survey is about gender, and we provided a other option that was a write-in. So what is your gender? Male, female, other, write-in. You think that's fairly uncontroversial. It is highly controversial, apparently. And that turned out to be the best way to filter out 4chan. Because that's where all the attack helicopters come in for the write-in for other gender. So it was really ironic in a weird way that the gender question turned out to be the best way to weed out people who were deliberately, who had high potential for, for this. We had a variety of write-in questions on the first page of the profile, and those turned out to be really, really good at helping us weed out. We also did a variety of other fairly basic things, right? If they have a really low standard deviation, a really high standard deviation, if all the responses are the same, if the age is impossible, the write-in for gender. So we did a variety of things to do the basic weeding, but the gender writing question was funny in an ironic way. Yeah. I think we have one.
Hi, thanks for sharing. It was a great talk. I'm not sure if I missed it, but could you go into a little bit of detail on how you actually sorted the games for strategy versus action? Was it much more of a sort of a rule of thumb, or was there actual data points that you collected for those?
Right, so for every game in our data set, we aggregate all the people who, sorry, I glanced over this. So for Europa Universalis, we look in our data for everyone who mentions Europa Universalis as one of their favorite games. We aggregate their profiles to create the essentially aggregate profile of the game of the core engaged audience. So we have this for all these games. So we have the 12 scores here, mapping just the strategy score and the excitement score based on that aggregate game profile. Thanks, I totally glanced over that.
Thank you.
So just a sheer functionality question. Nick over here. Hey. So I know normally I just yell without the microphone, but so I'm wondering how, like you guys had, what, 222,000 responses. So you had writing questions. How physically did you do that? Like how did you actually go through that many for write-in answers?
Oh, well, there are a lot individually, but there are far fewer unique entries. So internally, we keep a running database of, so every response that's already in the database, we don't have to send to Mechanical Turk. So, it was a problem that it actually collapsed fairly quickly, fairly early on. As you can imagine, the biggest problems are with games that have a large variety of spellings and possible misspellings. So Assassin's Creed Black Flag, my God. You can, like Sid Meier's Civilization 5, the variety of ways that people could list those games. But, it was, we caught a lot of the common misspellings, the Mechanical Turkers did. And so we have this, this growing lookup list now. So we don't look up every new response that comes in. Only those are not in the existing list.
Oh, it's not. There we go. Did you look after you cleaned the non-binary gender responses at whether there were any patterns in how non-binary players responded?
That's a great question. So in our sample, roughly 1%, almost exactly, of our respondents picked other and entered a valid non-binary response, typically gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, neutral, and so forth. We haven't looked too deep. What we have seen in terms of the overall game motivations is that in a lot of cases, they align more with how the people who identify as female look like, more than how the people identify as male look like. That's what we've seen so far in the data. We haven't taken a very deep dive, but at the high, just across the 12 motivations level, that's what we're seeing. I think we have time for like one very last question.
have you done any research on how motivations are affected by physical ability or the lack thereof? Like, for example, a gamer's motivations may be impacted by simply the games they are physically able to interact with.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We didn't include that question directly in the survey, but what we've seen is that across all the variables, that we have, there's always been, like, whether, even if we're just looking at gender and age, or the platform that they play on, or their favorite genre, there's always some interesting finding, surprising thing that comes out. So I'm sure, there will be interesting findings there too, but unfortunately it wasn't a parameter we had directly in the survey, but that's a great question. Yeah. Again, thanks so much. Time's up. Thanks so much for coming to my talk.